It was an ordinary Wednesday morning in the heart of a bustling city, the kind of day Zara Johnson had grown used to. The airport was packed with people, each person lost in their own world, rushing to catch a flight, preparing for business meetings, or maybe a vacation. Zara was no different. A seasoned professional, she had perfected the art of navigating airports with minimal stress. Today was supposed to be like any other, just another flight to a business meeting, just another routine that, while important, wouldn't be anything out of the ordinary. Zara had grown accustomed to these trips, her career thriving, her confidence unwavering. She wore a sharp, navy blue suit that hugged her frame just right, her makeup was perfect, and her hair, naturally curly, was neatly tucked into a sleek bun. She had a tight schedule, a presentation to give, and an ambitious client to impress. All she needed was a smooth flight, a couple of hours to relax, and some time to prepare for the meeting ahead. As she walked toward the gate, she noticed the usual hustle and bustle, the polite hum of conversations, the impatient glances from people watching the clock, and the steely-eyed airline staff who seemed to be in constant motion. Zara was used to it all, the crowds, the noise, the endless announcements. But today, something felt off. Maybe it was the way the gate agent had looked at her when she handed over her ticket. Maybe it was the unspoken judgment in his eyes, or the way he briefly glanced at the boarding pass and then at her, before nodding and signaling for her to board. Zara, as always, remained composed, walking toward the jet bridge. She made her way down the narrow hallway and onto the plane, greeted by the usual flight attendants who smiled politely but didn't seem to notice her much beyond the usual, "Hello, ma'am." She passed rows of seats, scanning for hers, business class, row 4. It was the seat she always booked when flying for work. It was comfortable, with just the right amount of space to spread out and get some work done, but more importantly, it was always quiet and private. She was looking forward to the peace it would provide during the flight. But as she approached the seat, something didn't feel right. She stopped just short of her row, her eyes falling on the flight attendant who was standing next to the seat, speaking to a man in the seat across the aisle. The man, Zara noted, was dressed in a suit much less impressive than hers, yet there was an undeniable arrogance about him. He was speaking loudly, gesturing with his hands, while the flight attendant, a woman in her late 30s, looked uncomfortable but nodded in agreement. Zara glanced at the man, sensing the tension in the air, but tried to ignore it. She reached the row, prepared to take her seat. But as she did, the flight attendant stopped her, a subtle tension rising in her voice. "Sorry, ma'am, but we have a slight issue," the attendant said, her words coming out in a tone that didn't match the professional veneer she was trying to maintain. Zara raised an eyebrow, momentarily confused. "Excuse me?" Zara asked, her voice calm but firm. "It's just that, well, there's been a seating mix-up. We need you to switch to a different seat," the attendant said, stepping aside to allow Zara to take a closer look at the row. The man, who had been speaking loudly, now fell silent, casting an almost dismissive glance in Zara's direction. Zara felt a sudden pang of unease, but she quickly masked it with a smile, not wanting to make a scene. She glanced at the row, then back at the attendant. "What do you mean by mix-up?" Zara asked, her voice a little more controlled, a little more probing. The flight attendant hesitated, then pointed across the aisle. "There's an issue with the seating configuration. We've got a passenger who's more suited to this section, and we need to accommodate him," she said, her tone shifting slightly as if choosing her words carefully. Zara's eyes narrowed as she followed the attendant's gesture. Across the aisle, the man in the less than impressive suit was now sitting up straight, looking directly at her. It wasn't a friendly look, there was something in his gaze that made Zara feel uncomfortable, like he was sizing her up. It was a look she knew too well, a look that made her skin prickle. Zara took a deep breath, not wanting to jump to conclusions, but the sinking feeling in her stomach was hard to ignore. "I'm sorry," she said slowly, "but I don't understand. My seat is in business class." Why would I need to move? Zara's voice had a hint of edge now, not out of anger, but out of confusion, and maybe, a little apprehension. The flight attendant glanced down, nervously shifting her weight. It's just that the passenger across the aisle, she began, but she was cut off by the man who had been sitting there. I think it's best if she just moves, he said loudly, interrupting her. He wasn't even looking at Zara now, but speaking directly to the flight attendant as though she were a subordinate, an afterthought in his world. His tone was condescending. Zara felt her pulse quicken. I'm afraid you're mistaken, Zara said firmly, now locking eyes with the man. I've booked this seat. It's mine. The man finally turned his gaze to her, his eyes narrowing as if her calmness irritated him. It's really not about what you think, sweetheart, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. There's no room for people like you in business class. I'm sure you can sit somewhere else. The words hung in the air, thick with an ugliness Zara had heard before but never expected in this situation. For a brief moment, Zara felt frozen. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her mind raced, but her body stayed still, rooted in the place where she stood. Was this really happening? She had flown this route dozens of times without issue. Never before had she been treated this way, not by anyone. The flight attendant, now visibly uncomfortable, tried to step in. Sir, that's not appropriate, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Zara was shaking with the realization of what had just transpired. She had been subjected to blatant racism. I'm not going to argue with you, Zara said, her voice barely above a whisper, but with an intensity that no one could miss. I'll take this up with someone who can actually handle it. Zara turned to walk back down the aisle, but the man, now smug, smirked at her retreating form. It was at that moment that Zara made a decision. She wasn't going to let this go. Not today. Not ever. She could feel the weight of the stairs around her as she made her way to the front of the plane. She had to find a way to speak to someone who could resolve this, someone who wouldn't ignore her. But as she reached the front of the plane, her heart sank when she saw the pilot, Captain James, standing near the cockpit, speaking to a crew member. His gaze was cold, assessing. She was certain, from the way he looked her up and down, that he had already made up his mind about her. Zara paused, unsure of what to do next. But before she could approach him, a voice from behind her stopped her in her tracks. Zara, a familiar voice called out. It was Mark, her husband, standing near the gate, his face a mask of concern. Mark was always her rock, her protector, and in that moment, seeing him there felt like a breath of fresh air. I heard, he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with urgency. What's going on? Zara turned to him, and in that instant, all the emotion she had kept locked inside erupted. The situation wasn't just about a seat, it was about something deeper. Something that had happened far too many times in this country. I'm not going to take this, Zara whispered, a wave of resolve settling over her. We need to do something about it. Mark nodded, his jaw set in a tight line. He had always been fiercely protective of Zara, but now, there was something else in his eyes, something that told her he was ready to fight. And fight they would. Zara stood at the front of the plane, her mind racing, heart pounding, as Mark approached her with a determined look on his face. She could hear the muffled voices of the other passengers behind her, some clearly unaware of the confrontation unfolding, others whispering in hushed tones. The tension in the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Zara took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm, but she could feel the fury building inside her. She had been humiliated in front of strangers, dismissed by someone who didn't even know her, who thought her place in society was lesser simply because of the color of her skin. The injustice was suffocating, and it made her blood boil. But now, with Mark by her side, she felt a surge of strength. Mark approached, his presence like a shield, grounding her. His broad frame was a stark contrast to the small, tense space around them. Zara could feel her pulse slowing, her breathing becoming more steady, but she knew this was only the beginning. Mark's eyes scanned her, taking in the tension in her posture, the sharp edge to her voice. He had heard everything, the man's words, the flight attendant's hesitation. He knew exactly what had happened. "What's going on?" Mark asked, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of anger. Zara could see the tightness in his jaw, the flicker of resolve in his eyes. He wasn't going to let this slide. "It's unbelievable," Zara said, her voice barely above a whisper but filled with a quiet fury. "The pilot, Captain James, he's treating me like I don't belong here. He told me I needed to move because people like me don't belong in business class. And then he just dismissed me." Her throat tightened with the weight of the words, but she forced herself to keep talking. "Mark, this is insane. This is not just about a seat. This is about me being treated as if I don't deserve what I've earned." Mark's face hardened, his expression shifting from concern to something deeper. He had always known that the world was unfair, that people like Zara faced challenges every day that others couldn't even begin to understand. But seeing it up close, hearing the venom in the man's voice, hit him differently. It struck a raw nerve, one that made his protective instincts flare. He wasn't just angry on her behalf, he was personally offended. The man had dared to speak to his wife that way, and now he was going to pay for it. "Stay here," Mark said firmly, placing a reassuring hand on Zara's arm. He turned toward the cockpit, his movements deliberate. Zara watched him walk away, her heart in her throat. She knew that Mark wasn't just going to sit back and let this injustice slide. He had the kind of presence that demanded attention, and if anyone could make the airline take action, it was him. As Mark approached the cockpit, Zara's mind continued to race. She could hear snippets of conversations from the surrounding passengers, some of them turning to glance at her, some whispering, others trying to avoid the uncomfortable scene unfolding. Zara's thoughts swirled. How had she let herself get into this position? Why was she letting this man control her destiny? She had worked too hard, fought too long, to let someone like Captain James strip her of her dignity. But there was a part of her that wondered if she was overreacting. Maybe she should have just taken her seat and let it go. After all, it wasn't worth making a scene, was it? But the more she thought about it, the more she realized it was exactly worth making a scene. Zara's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Mark's voice, now raised, reaching her ears. He wasn't shouting, but there was no mistaking the authority in his tone. She couldn't hear all the words, but she could sense the growing tension in the air. Mark was speaking to someone, a flight attendant, a crew member. She couldn't see who, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that Mark was taking control of the situation. Zara felt a surge of relief, but also a sense of guilt. She had never wanted to make her husband fight her battles. She had always handled things on her own. But this was different. Moments later, Mark returned, his face tight with anger but also a quiet determination. Zara noticed a few subtle changes in his demeanor. He was no longer just her husband. In that moment, he was an advocate, a defender, a man who had had enough. And she knew, deep down, that this wasn't going to end the way it had started. The pilot might have thought he had control, but now the tables were turning. Mark didn't waste any time. He moved past Zara, walking toward the cockpit with purpose. The captain had been standing there with another crew member, both looking down the aisle. Mark didn't hesitate, he approached them directly, his steps firm, his posture straight and unyielding. He cleared his throat, making sure the captain was aware of his presence. The two men locked eyes for a moment, and in that instant, Zara could see the tension between them. The captain, despite his position, couldn't ignore the force of Mark's presence. "I'm sorry," Mark began, his voice low but clear. "I don't think you quite understand the situation. My wife, Zara, is not just a passenger. She is a paying customer, just like everyone else on this plane. She deserves the respect she's earned. And I'm not going to stand by while you treat her like this." Captain James, who had been trying to maintain his professional facade, now visibly stiffened. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir," he said, his voice cold, but it was clear that his confidence was beginning to falter. "I think you do," Mark replied, his eyes narrowing. "And I think you know that what you did was wrong. I don't care who you think you are. No one gets to treat people like that. You may have thought you could get away with it, but you're wrong." The captain opened his mouth to respond, but Mark was already moving forward, his steps commanding attention. "This isn't just about the seat," Mark continued, his voice unwavering. "This is about respect. And if you can't offer that, you have no place in this cockpit." Zara felt a surge of pride as she listened to her husband, but she also realized the weight of the situation was escalating quickly. Mark wasn't just confronting a man who had disrespected her, he was confronting a system that allowed that kind of behavior to continue. In that moment, Zara realized that this wasn't just about her. This was about a larger issue that was systemic, deep-rooted in society. It was about equality, fairness, and dignity. It was about every person who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced because of the color of their skin. This was a moment that demanded action, and Zara wasn't going to back down. As Mark turned to leave the cockpit, the flight attendant who had been caught in the middle of the situation looked at him with a mixture of uncertainty and relief. Zara saw her glance, and for the first time, the flight attendant didn't seem to be trying to avoid the confrontation. She seemed to recognize the gravity of the moment. Zara nodded to her, a silent acknowledgement that this wasn't just about one man's words or actions, it was about breaking down the walls of silence that allowed this kind of behavior to fester. Zara knew, then, that she had made the right decision. She had made a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been treated unfairly. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And as she stood there, her heart still racing but her resolve stronger than ever, she understood that sometimes, the hardest moments were the ones that would change everything. The hours that followed were a blur. The plane cruised steadily through the skies, but the atmosphere inside was charged with an underlying tension. The earlier confrontation had rattled everyone, passengers and crew alike. Zara felt it too, but in a different way. She felt lighter somehow, her heart not as heavy as it had been earlier when she sat down, preparing for what was supposed to be a routine flight. It was strange to think that something as simple as a flight could become the backdrop for such a personal battle, but here she was, in the middle of a story that would define so much of her life going forward. Mark was calm, almost unnervingly so, as he sat next to her. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes never stopped scanning the cabin, keeping a watchful eye on the crew, on the passengers. The confrontation in the cockpit had taken a toll on him, but not in the way one might expect. It wasn't the stress of arguing with the captain or confronting the injustice that was draining him, it was the weight of knowing that this wasn't just about a single incident. It wasn't just about one person's disregard for another's dignity. This was a reflection of something much bigger, something that had been quietly festering for years. Zara looked at her husband, her mind still processing everything that had happened. She felt a sense of awe at his strength, his unshakable resolve. She had always known him to be a man of integrity, someone who would stand up for what was right, but to see it in action like this, it was more than she could have imagined. It was as if he had become a force of nature, channeling his anger and his desire for justice into something powerful, something that could no longer be ignored. Her mind flashed back to the moment when the captain had tried to dismiss her, when his words had tried to dehumanize her, to reduce her to something less than. It was a moment she had lived through many times before, but never with such intensity. Never in such a public space. She had fought battles like this in her own mind, quietly, in isolation, but seeing it unfold in real time had changed something in her. She had been seen. She had been heard. And it had felt good, no, it had felt necessary. The flight attendants, who had once stood silently by, were now more alert. They moved about the cabin with purpose, occasionally glancing over at Mark and Zara as though checking for any further signs of tension. The flight attendants were not accustomed to this kind of situation, and they had no idea how to manage the fallout from the altercation. For the first time, it seemed like the passengers were paying closer attention to what was happening, as though they, too, had recognized the importance of what had transpired. As the plane continued its journey, Zara couldn't help but overhear bits and pieces of conversation from the passengers around them. Most of them were speaking in hushed tones, as though afraid of attracting attention. Some of them were trying to process what they had just witnessed. Others were murmuring their support for Mark's actions, a few even exchanging nods of approval when they caught his eye. It was a quiet show of solidarity, but Zara could feel the weight of it. There was a shift in the air. The event had sparked something inside of them, something that couldn't be easily brushed aside. Zara's thoughts were interrupted when the flight attendant who had been involved in the earlier incident approached them. She had a tentative look on her face, her hands clasped together as she stood in front of Mark and Zara. There was no longer the air of discomfort that had hung around her earlier, but rather a sense of uncertainty, like she wasn't quite sure what to say, what to do. I just wanted to apologize for what happened, she said, her voice soft but sincere. I didn't expect any of this to escalate like it did. I wasn't aware of the whole situation, and I should have been more sensitive to your needs. Zara raised an eyebrow at the flight attendant's apology. It was more than she had expected, but it didn't erase the sting of what had happened. It's not just about being sensitive, Zara replied, her tone calm but firm. It's about respecting people. It's about doing what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. Mark nodded in agreement. You don't have to apologize to us, he said. You just have to be more aware of how things like this can affect others. It's about understanding that we all deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter who we are. The flight attendant nodded, her face flushing slightly. I understand now, she said quietly. I'll do better next time. Zara offered a small, understanding smile, but there was a deep ache inside her. The apology, though well-meaning, didn't change the fundamental issue. This wasn't just about an apology, it was about a larger shift that needed to happen. It was about everyone recognizing their part in perpetuating these unspoken biases, these microaggressions, whether intentional or not. It wasn't just about Mark standing up for her, it was about every single person who had witnessed the incident, who had heard the captain's dismissive words, and who had seen the flight attendant's discomfort. It was about everyone being forced to confront their own assumptions and their own behaviors. As the flight continued, Mark and Zara sat in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a silence filled with the weight of their shared understanding, their shared responsibility. The moment had passed, but the ripples of it would continue to affect them long after the plane landed. They both knew that. They knew that there was more work to be done, more battles to fight, and that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But they were ready for it. And then, as if on cue, the captain came down the aisle, his steps slow and deliberate. He had clearly been informed of the situation, and now it was his turn to address the matter. His face was grim, his eyes avoiding direct contact with either of them. He stopped in front of their seats, looking down at them, his posture stiff. Look, I know we had a rough start today, the captain began, his voice much quieter now. I want to make sure this doesn't escalate any further. I made a mistake, and I shouldn't have treated you like that. I want to assure you that this won't happen again. I'll make sure of it. Zara and Mark exchanged a glance. There was no arrogance in his voice now, no defensiveness. The shift was real. The change in his demeanor was undeniable. But that didn't make up for what had happened. It didn't erase the impact of his actions, and it didn't fix the underlying issues that had allowed the situation to unfold the way it had. "You're right," Mark said, his voice steady. "This can't happen again." But it's not just about one person's actions. It's about all of us doing better. It's about everyone, crew and passengers alike, recognizing that we are all human beings, deserving of respect. I'm not asking for an apology, but I am asking for a change. The captain nodded, his expression serious. "Understood," he said, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful. "I'll take that to heart." Mark and Zara watched as he turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps receding into the distance. The encounter had ended as abruptly as it had started, but the air in the cabin felt different now. The passengers were no longer whispering amongst themselves. The crew was no longer tense. It was as though a collective breath had been taken, and everyone was quietly reflecting on the events that had transpired. Zara couldn't help but wonder if the captain's words were truly genuine, or if they were merely a product of the pressure he now felt. Either way, she knew that this moment would continue to echo in the lives of everyone who had witnessed it. She glanced at Mark, feeling a sense of gratitude and pride. He had done what he set out to do. He had fought for her. And in doing so, he had made a powerful statement to everyone around him. It was a statement that would continue to resonate, a statement that said, "This is not just about one person. This is about all of us, and the way we treat each other." And for the first time in a long while, Zara felt like she wasn't alone. She wasn't just a passenger in someone else's story. She was the one telling it. She was the one making sure it would be heard. The plane finally began its descent, the rhythmic hum of the engines providing a strange sense of finality. Zara sat silently next to Mark, her thoughts a whirl of emotions, unanswered questions, and a growing sense of change. Outside the window, the landscape below was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, casting long shadows across the sprawling city beneath them. They had been through so much during this flight, but the journey wasn't over yet. They had only just begun to understand the full extent of what had transpired, and its consequences were far from clear. As the plane touched down on the tarmac, Zara felt a subtle shift in the air. The tension that had hung over the cabin was now gone, replaced by a quiet anticipation. The passengers remained seated, waiting for the seatbelt sign to turn off, but there was something different in the way they carried themselves. Some passengers glanced over at Zara and Mark, offering nods of recognition or brief, apologetic smiles. Others seemed lost in their own thoughts, but all of them knew what had happened, what they had witnessed. They couldn't unsee it, couldn't pretend it hadn't changed something in them, even if they weren't fully aware of what that change was. Mark leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply, his gaze fixed out the window. He hadn't said much since the confrontation had ended, and Zara could tell that he was reflecting on everything that had just occurred. His mind, like hers, was processing not just the events of the flight but the broader implications of it all. It wasn't just about him defending her in that moment, it was about the larger picture. It was about racism, yes, but it was also about power dynamics, societal expectations, and the ways in which ordinary people like themselves were thrust into extraordinary situations. How had something so small, so seemingly insignificant, turned into a catalyst for change? As the plane taxied to the gate, the captain's voice came over the intercom, breaking the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at our destination. Please remain seated until the plane has come to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign has been turned off. We appreciate your cooperation and thank you for flying with us today." Zara felt a mix of emotions as she unbuckled her seatbelt. The formal announcement felt out of place, almost like an afterthought in the context of what had just happened. The captain's words felt hollow, like a scripted line that had no real meaning anymore. In that moment, Zara didn't feel like a passenger. She didn't feel like someone who had just finished a flight. She felt like someone who had lived through an ordeal, someone who had witnessed something deeply personal, and now had to figure out how to live with it. As the passengers began to file out of the plane, there were more quiet exchanges between them. Zara and Mark gathered their things, but before they could leave their seats, a flight attendant appeared at the end of the aisle. It was the same attendant who had apologized earlier, and her expression now was one of genuine concern. She looked at Zara and Mark with a hesitant but determined look, as if she was about to say something important. "I just wanted to check in and see if you're okay," the attendant said softly, her voice laced with a sincerity that wasn't there before. "I know things were difficult on the flight, and I just want to make sure you're not feeling uncomfortable or unsafe." Zara met the flight attendant's gaze and nodded. She could tell that the attendant was trying, genuinely trying, to make amends for the awkwardness of earlier. But Zara also knew that words, no matter how sincere, weren't enough to heal the wounds that had been inflicted that day. The encounter had opened a door that had been locked for so long, and there was no going back now. The reality of racism, the deep-seated biases that ran through every aspect of society, could no longer be ignored. "We're fine," Mark replied calmly, though there was a seriousness to his tone. "But I think you need to understand that it's not just about making sure we're okay. It's about everyone recognizing that what happened here isn't an isolated incident. These things happen every day, in different forms, and they need to be addressed. People need to stand up, even when it's uncomfortable." The attendant nodded slowly, processing Mark's words. She had clearly never thought of it that way before, and it seemed to hit her harder than anything else. "You're right," she murmured. "I'll do better." Zara smiled faintly, feeling the weight of the conversation. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about the realization that this was a teachable moment, not just for the flight attendant but for everyone involved. It was about people waking up to the truth and realizing that change couldn't happen without uncomfortable conversations, without confronting the things that made us squirm. It was about turning this incident into something more than just a fleeting moment. As they made their way down the jet bridge toward the terminal, Zara and Mark were met by a representative from the airline. He was dressed in a crisp uniform, his expression neutral, but there was a subtle tension in his posture, as though he, too, had been affected by what had transpired. He extended a hand to Mark and Zara as they approached, his grip firm but brief. "I'm terribly sorry for what happened," he began, his voice low. "We take these matters very seriously. Rest assured, the captain's actions will be reviewed, and will take the necessary steps to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again." Zara felt a surge of frustration well up inside her. The words were too familiar. The rehearsed apology, the hollow assurances, it was all too predictable. She didn't want another apology. She didn't want promises of action that were never followed through. What she wanted, what she needed, was a real change. She needed to see that the airline understood the gravity of what had happened, that they were willing to confront the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Apologies, no matter how well-intentioned, didn't erase the harm done. They didn't fix the problem. "We've heard that before," Zara said quietly, her voice laced with a quiet strength that surprised even her. "And we don't need empty promises. We need action. We need people to understand that this isn't just about one bad flight. It's about the culture that allowed this to happen. And that needs to change." The airline representative looked taken aback, but Zara could see the shift in his expression. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, but something in her words had cut through the formalities, had penetrated the surface level of his professional demeanor. He was forced to confront the reality of the situation. "You're right," he said after a pause, his voice quieter now. "I can't pretend to understand what you went through, but I will take your words back to the leadership team. I will make sure that this is addressed." Mark nodded, his arm around Zara's shoulders as they continued walking. "We'll be watching," he said simply. "This isn't over." They exited the airport, the cool evening air greeting them like an old friend. As they walked toward the parking lot, Zara couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within her. The incident had forced her to confront so many uncomfortable truths, not just about society but about herself. She had always known that racism existed, that prejudice was deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life. But to have it so blatantly thrust into her face, to see it unfold in front of her, she couldn't pretend it wasn't real anymore. Mark squeezed her hand, pulling her from her thoughts. "We did the right thing," he said quietly, his voice full of conviction. "And no matter what happens next, this will never be just another day on a plane. This will never be forgotten." Zara nodded, a sense of quiet resolve settling in her chest. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew one thing for certain: their lives had been irrevocably changed by this incident, and whatever happened next, they would continue to fight for what was right. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. The weeks following the incident were a blur of media coverage, public reactions, and an endless stream of phone calls. Zara and Mark had become unlikely symbols of a larger conversation that had been happening in society for years, but it had never felt so personal until now. The story of the racist pilot and his disgraceful treatment of Zara had spread quickly, becoming a flashpoint for conversations about systemic racism, accountability, and the ways in which ordinary people could stand up against injustice. But while the national attention had been overwhelming, Zara couldn't shake the feeling that something more profound had shifted within her, a transformation that had started in the confined space of that airplane but was now expanding into every part of her life. As news outlets continued to cover the story, the airline faced growing pressure to act. A public relations nightmare was unfolding, one that the company had failed to handle with the urgency it required. There were calls for boycotts, petitions circulating online demanding justice, and protests outside the airline's headquarters. Social media was ablaze, with people from all walks of life sharing their own experiences of discrimination, calling for accountability not just from the airline but from the entire industry. The company's initial response, though apologetic, had been perceived as insufficient. The public wasn't satisfied with mere words, they wanted real change. The board of directors, under mounting pressure, convened a special meeting. It had taken weeks for the airline to address the situation adequately, but when they finally did, they were forced to act decisively. The pilot involved in the incident was fired immediately, and the airline's CEO made a public statement acknowledging the deep flaws in their culture and promising sweeping reforms. Zara, while appreciative of the actions taken, couldn't help but feel that these changes were too little, too late. The system, she realized, was built on more than just the actions of one man, it was built on biases ingrained in every level of society. A single firing, no matter how public, wouldn't erase the deep-rooted racism that existed everywhere, and she couldn't let herself rest until there was more than just a change in personnel. There needed to be a shift in the way the entire industry, and society at large, viewed racial inequality. Meanwhile, Zara had become a reluctant but powerful voice in the ongoing conversation about race and injustice. She had been approached by various media outlets for interviews, speaking engagements, and public appearances. At first, she hesitated, not wanting to be thrust further into the spotlight. She was just an ordinary woman who had been caught in an extraordinary circumstance, and she didn't feel like a hero or an activist. She had simply acted in the moment to protect herself, her dignity, and her family. But the more she reflected on the impact of her actions, the more she realized that her story had the potential to inspire others. If she could stand up in the face of injustice, perhaps others could find the courage to do the same. Mark, ever the supportive partner, encouraged her to share her story. "This isn't just about us anymore," he told her one evening as they sat together in their living room, the television news playing softly in the background. "People need to hear what happened, because this is bigger than you or me. It's bigger than one incident on one flight. This is about a pattern, a history, and a system that needs to change." Zara nodded, though her heart weighed heavy with the thought of publicly reliving the painful events of the flight. "I'm not sure I want to be the face of something like this," she confessed, the vulnerability in her voice evident. "It's too personal. Too painful." Mark reached out and gently took her hand, his touch warm and steady. You don't have to do it alone, he said softly. We'll do it together. And you don't have to carry the weight of it all. Just tell your truth. Let others decide what they do with it. It was Mark's unwavering belief in the importance of their story that eventually pushed Zara to agree to an interview with a national news outlet. The conversation was difficult, raw, and emotionally charged. Zara spoke candidly about the pilot's refusal to fly her, about the harsh words he had used, and about the shock and fear she had felt when Mark stepped in to defend her. She talked about her family's history of resilience, her determination to live without fear, and how, for the first time, she had been forced to confront the reality of systemic racism in a way she had never imagined. Her words resonated with viewers. Thousands of people tuned in to watch the interview, and the reaction was overwhelming. Messages of support flooded in from across the country, from people of all races and backgrounds who had been deeply moved by Zara's strength and courage. But there were also voices of dissent, those who believed that Zara had overreacted or that the situation had been blown out of proportion. These voices were few, but they were loud, and their presence served as a reminder that change was never easy. There would always be those who would fight to maintain the status quo. Despite the criticism, Zara refused to back down. In her heart, she knew that the fight wasn't about being liked or pleasing everyone. It was about truth, about breaking through the walls of indifference that allowed racism to persist unchecked. She continued to speak out, to share her story, and to demand accountability from the airline and from society as a whole. As the months went by, Zara found herself becoming more involved in advocacy work, partnering with organizations dedicated to fighting racial injustice. She spoke at rallies, participated in panel discussions, and worked with community leaders to address the root causes of discrimination. Her life had taken a turn she never expected, but she found purpose in this new path. She had been transformed by the events of that flight, but so had the world around her. She had become a catalyst for change, and though the journey was long and the road ahead was still uncertain, she knew that it had been worth it. One evening, as Zara and Mark sat on their porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Zara reflected on everything that had transpired. It had been a year since that fateful flight, and though much had changed, she felt as though she was just getting started. The world hadn't transformed overnight, but there had been progress. The conversation about racism was no longer a quiet whisper, it was a loud, unavoidable roar that demanded attention. Mark, sensing the weight of her thoughts, placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he said softly, his voice filled with pride. "You made a difference." Zara smiled, though it was bittersweet. "We did it," she corrected him. "And we're just getting started." With that, they sat in silence, knowing that while the battle was far from over, the fight had already begun to change the world. As the months continued to unfold, Zara and Mark found themselves deeper into the work that had grown out of that fateful flight. Their lives, once defined by the routine of work, family, and quiet moments of normalcy, had been irrevocably altered. The flight that had seemed like an ordinary event had sparked a nationwide conversation about race, injustice, and the responsibility of individuals and institutions to confront systemic biases. The unexpected notoriety had placed them at the center of a movement they hadn't anticipated, and with it came challenges and opportunities they hadn't prepared for. Zara's role as an advocate for racial justice had evolved in ways that surprised her. She had never sought to be an activist, but it seemed as if fate had pushed her into that position. She was asked to speak at high-profile events, participate in roundtable discussions, and offer her perspective on racial inequality in the workplace. Her voice, once quiet and reserved, was now heard in boardrooms, on national television, and in front of audiences that hung on every word she said. People saw her not only as a victim of racial discrimination but as a beacon of hope for those who had endured similar experiences and felt powerless. Her story of resilience, of standing firm in the face of injustice, resonated deeply with people from all walks of life, and she became an unexpected symbol of change. Yet, with the visibility came the pressure. Zara was bombarded with requests from journalists, nonprofits, and politicians who wanted her to lend her name to their causes. She had to navigate the fine line between being a voice for the voiceless and maintaining her own boundaries. It was exhausting, and at times, she wondered if her involvement in the movement was truly making the difference she hoped for, or if it was simply part of a larger, more performative narrative that would eventually fizzle out. Mark was always by her side, providing the unwavering support she needed. Though he had never sought public attention, he too found himself thrust into the spotlight, standing alongside Zara at press conferences, speaking out against the injustices that they had both endured. His once quiet life had been upended, and the burden of being part of something bigger than themselves weighed heavily on him. But Mark had always been Zara's rock, and no matter the emotional toll, he knew that this fight wasn't just hers, it was theirs. They were in it together, and his commitment to her, to the cause, never wavered. One evening, as Zara prepared for another public speech, she found herself standing before the mirror, staring at her reflection. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her. The confidence that she once lacked had become her armor, but with it came the fear of losing herself in the process. Her life had become a whirlwind of interviews, meetings, and speeches, and though she was honored by the opportunity to use her voice, she couldn't help but wonder if she was still the woman she had been before everything changed. "Do you ever wish it would all just go back to normal?" Mark asked gently, sensing her unease as he entered the room. Zara sighed and leaned against the vanity. "Sometimes. But normal isn't enough, is it? What happened to me on that plane, it's happening every day to people who don't have a voice, who don't have the platform I've been given. I can't pretend that everything's okay. I can't go back to being silent." Mark nodded in understanding, stepping closer to her. "I know. But it's okay to feel conflicted. This is a huge responsibility, and sometimes it feels like too much. You don't have to carry all of it alone." Zara smiled faintly, appreciating his words. "I know. I'm not sure how to keep going, sometimes. The weight of it all feels like it's too much." He reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands, his gaze steady and full of compassion. "You're not alone in this. You've never been alone. I'm here with you. We're in this together. And we'll find our way through it." Zara closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to lean into the comfort of his touch. It was a small gesture, but it reminded her of the foundation they had built together, the love, the shared purpose, the understanding. It was a reminder that, no matter how much the world had changed around them, the most important thing was that they still had each other. When Zara took the stage at the national conference the next week, she felt a familiar sense of nervousness stir in her stomach. It was a feeling she had become accustomed to, but now, it was laced with something else, an awareness of the power her words had. As she stepped to the podium, the applause that greeted her felt like both a burden and an honor. She had become a voice for so many people, and as much as she wanted to do justice to their stories, she was acutely aware that her own story was still unfolding. She was still processing the complexities of what had happened on that plane, and the lessons it had taught her about herself, about society, and about the world she had to fight to change. The crowd settled into a hushed silence as Zara began to speak. Her voice, steady and clear, echoed through the room. "When that pilot refused to fly me, I was hurt. I was angry. But more than that, I was scared. Scared because I knew what he did wasn't just about me, it was about a system that had been conditioned to see people like me as less than. It was about a culture that allowed that kind of behavior to exist unchecked. And that fear made me realize something. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, who had been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin." She paused, allowing the words to sink in, and for a moment, she could see the faces in the audience, some nodding, others wiping away tears. There was a collective understanding in the room, a shared acknowledgement that change was necessary, that the status quo could no longer stand. Zara continued, "This fight is bigger than one airline, one pilot, or one incident. It's about dismantling the systems that perpetuate this kind of hatred. It's about all of us coming together to hold each other accountable, to create a world where our children can grow up without the fear of being judged based on their race or background. I stand here not just for me, but for all of us. This is a fight for all of humanity, and it's a fight we can win, together." The applause that followed was deafening, but it wasn't the kind of applause Zara had once sought. It wasn't a recognition of her as an individual, it was a collective cry for change. It was the sound of a society beginning to wake up to the reality of its own flaws, and the recognition that, together, they could do something about it. As she left the stage, Zara felt a sense of peace that she hadn't expected. She had made her statement, shared her truth, and for the first time since that plane, she felt as though she was truly being heard. The journey had been long and fraught with difficulty, but she realized now that the change she had hoped for wasn't just about big moments like this one, it was about the small, everyday actions that would eventually lead to a larger shift. The conversations, the actions, the accountability, it all mattered. And as Zara walked off the stage, hand in hand with Mark, she knew that their journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. The path ahead would be challenging, but together, they were ready to face whatever came next. The fight for justice, for equality, for dignity, none of it would be easy, but Zara was no longer the woman she had been on that flight. She was stronger, more determined, and more resolved than ever to see this fight through to the end.